Why did this family portrait leave experts speechless? The truth will shock you. Dr. Amelia Richardson had spent 15 years studying historical medical conditions through photographic evidence, but nothing had prepared her for what she saw on that humid Tuesday morning in June 2024. As a toxicologist and medical historian at Emory University, she'd been invited to examine a collection of 19th century photographs donated to the Atlanta Medical History Archive. Most of the images were unremarkable, standard portraits of families from the late 1800s and early 1900s, but one photograph stopped her cold. The portrait showed a black family of 5, formally posed in a professional photography studio. The quality was exceptional for 1905, with sharp detail and careful composition. The father sat in a chair on the left, wearing a well-tailored suit, his posture dignified. The mother stood beside him, her hand resting on his shoulder, dressed in a high-necked white blouse with delicate lace. A boy of about 9 stood on the father's other side, and a girl of perhaps 12 stood next to her mother. But it was the baby that captured Amelia's attention. The infant, who appeared to be between 8 months and a year old, sat on the mother's lap, held securely in her arms. The child was dressed in a white christening gown, elaborate and beautifully made. Amelia picked up her magnifying glass and moved the lens slowly across the photograph. When she reached the baby, she froze. Something was wrong. The infant's face showed subtle but unmistakable signs that Amelia had been trained to recognize. The area around the eyes was slightly swollen, with a peculiar discoloration that even the sepia tones couldn't disguise. The baby's skin had an unusual pallor, almost luminescent, that contrasted starkly with the healthy complexions of the other family members. Most telling were the faint but visible marks on the baby's hands, a modeled pattern that Amelia had seen before, but only in medical textbooks. Her heart racing, she reached for her laptop and pulled up a digital database of historical poisoning cases. After 20 minutes of careful comparison, she sat back, her hands trembling. The baby was showing classic signs of arsenic poisoning. Amelia looked at the index card. Family portrait, Savannah, Georgia, April 1905. Photographer, Marcus Webb Studio. Donated from the Morrison Estate Collection. She studied the photograph again. This wasn't just a historical curiosity. This was evidence of a child who had been slowly poisoned over 119 years ago. The symptoms were clear. The periorbital edema, the skin discoloration, the mottling pattern that appeared when arsenic accumulated over time. Chronic exposure meant this wasn't accidental. Someone had been poisoning this baby, and likely the whole family, over an extended period. Amelia photographed the image and opened her email. She needed colleagues who specialized in 19th century African American history in Georgia. She needed to find out who this family was and what had happened to them. As she typed, a cold realization settled over her. The mother held her baby so protectively. Did she know her child was sick? The father's expression seemed worried, tense. The older children stood close to their parents, seeking protection. This wasn't just a family portrait. This was a family in danger, captured on film while they were already being slowly killed. Dr. James Mitchell responded within 2 hours. Can you come to Savannah? I think I know who this family might be. If I'm right, this is bigger than poisoning. Much bigger. Amelia made the drive the next morning. James met her at the Georgia Historical Society's research library, where he'd already spread out documents, newspapers, and photographs. The photographer's name gave it away, James said. Marcus Webb Studio. There was only one black photographer in Savannah operating in 1905, Marcus Webb. He kept meticulous records. James pulled out a leather-bound ledger. Webb logged every photograph. Here. He pointed to an entry dated April 15th, 1905. Family portrait. Daniel and Sarah Williams with children Thomas, 9, Elizabeth Reynolds, 12, and infant Grace, 10 months. Payment, $2. Note, Mrs. Williams very concerned about preserving image. Mentioned family illness. Paid extra for rush processing. The Williams family, Amelia breathed. James pulled out a newspaper clipping from the Savannah Tribune dated May 20th, 1905. Tragedy strikes prominent family. Daniel and Sarah Williams found dead. Amelia read quickly. Daniel and Sarah Williams had been found dead in their home on May 18th, 1905, just 5 weeks after the portrait was taken. Official cause, a sudden illness, possibly influenza. The 3 children had survived. They'd been staying with Sarah's mother. Sudden illness, Amelia said. Code for arsenic poisoning. Exactly, but look at this. James pulled out another clipping from 3 weeks before the deaths. Local businessman contests property claim. First African church fights for land rights. The article described a legal dispute over valuable downtown Savannah land. First African church claimed ownership based on an 1870 deed, but a white businessman named Cornelius Ashford had produced a deed dated 1898, claiming the same property. The church disputed its authenticity. James pulled out a court document. Daniel Williams was a carpenter and property assessor. He had document analysis training. The church hired him to examine Ashford's deed. He pointed to a date. Daniel submitted findings on March 28, 1905. He testified that Ashford's deed was forged. Wrong paper, wrong ink. Signatures didn't match 1898 records. He had physical evidence proving fraud. Amelia felt pieces clicking. Daniel Williams was the key witness against a powerful white businessman. His testimony could have sent Ashford to prison. The court scheduled a final hearing for June 1905. James's voice dropped. Daniel and Sarah died May 18th, 3 weeks before that hearing. And the baby showed poisoning signs in the April photograph, Amelia added. Someone started poisoning them right after Daniel submitted his findings. James showed her a city directory page. Sarah Williams was a laundress. Her client list includes the Ashford family residence. She worked for Cornelius Ashford, Amelia said, horror dawning. She went to his house regularly. Twice weekly. Easy access to give gifts, food, drink, household items she'd take home. Amelia looked at the photograph again. The mother holding her child protectively while poison was already in the infant's system. Sarah wouldn't have suspected anything. Arsenic was easy to obtain in 1905. Sold as rat poison, insecticide, even medicine. The symptoms could be mistaken for dozens of illnesses. What happened to the children? James pulled out documents. After their parents died, Thomas, Elizabeth, and baby Grace were sent to Sarah's mother, Martha Johnson, in Jacksonville, Florida. Martha left Savannah within a week. I think she knew the truth and wanted them away from whoever killed their parents. Did they survive? James slid across a photograph of an elderly black woman. This is Grace Williams, photographed in 1987. She lived to 82. Is she still living? Died in 1989, but her daughter is alive. When I called yesterday and told her what you found, she said she'd been waiting her whole life for someone to ask. Dorothy Williams Harper lived in a well-maintained bungalow in Atlanta's West End, her porch decorated with hanging ferns. She was in her early 60s, with silver-streaked hair and warm brown eyes that reminded Amelia of the mother in the photograph. Come in, Dorothy said, leading them to a living room filled with family photographs. I made sweet tea. This will be a long conversation. Dorothy pulled out a wooden box from a cabinet. My grandmother Grace gave this to me when I was 25. She said, someday someone will ask the right questions. When they do, give them this. Inside were letters, newspaper clippings, a small journal, and photographs, including another copy of the 1905 portrait. Grandma Grace didn't remember the poisoning. She was just a baby. But she remembered what her grandmother Martha told her, and what her siblings Thomas and Elizabeth remembered. They passed down every detail. Dorothy picked up the photograph. This picture was taken because Grandma Martha insisted. She was Sarah's mother and had been worried for weeks. Sarah told her that baby Grace wasn't thriving, not gaining weight, skin looked wrong, seemed listless. Martha wanted a photograph in case something happened. She had a feeling. Did Martha suspect poisoning? Amelia asked. Not at first, but she knew something was wrong. And she knew Daniel was involved in that church case, knew he'd made an enemy of Cornelius Ashford. Martha remembered how things worked. Black men who challenged powerful white men didn't live long. Dorothy pulled out a brittle handwritten letter. This is from Martha to her sister in 1906, a year after Daniel and Sarah died. She couldn't mail it, too dangerous, but she kept it. She read aloud, My dear sister, I must tell someone the truth. Daniel and Sarah were murdered. The white man whose fraud Daniel exposed sent poison hidden in gifts and food. Sarah brought it home and fed it to her family, never knowing. Baby Grace was sick for weeks before the photograph. I begged Sarah to stop working for that family, but she needed the wages. By the time Daniel and Sarah died, I knew what happened. But who would believe me? Who would investigate 2 black deaths in Savannah? Dorothy's voice broke. Martha took those children and ran. She knew if she stayed, if she accused Ashford, she'd be killed too, and the children would be orphaned completely. So she kept silent to protect them, James said quietly. She kept silent, but she kept evidence. Everything. The photograph showing baby Grace already poisoned, Sarah's work records proving she worked for Ashford, newspaper clippings about the property case, Daniel's court testimony. She gave it all to Grace when she was old enough to understand. Dorothy pulled out another document. This is Daniel's original report on Ashford's forged deed. Martha somehow got a copy before Daniel was killed. Look at the detail. He documented everything. Paper composition, ink age analysis, signature comparisons. This would have destroyed Ashford in court. Amelia examined the document carefully. Daniel Williams had been thorough, methodical, professional. His analysis was irrefutable. What happened to the church property case after Daniel died? Amelia asked. Dorothy's expression hardened. Without Daniel's testimony, the church couldn't prove fraud. Ashford won. First African Church lost that property. 5 acres in downtown Savannah. Today, it would be worth millions. James spent the next week in Savannah archives while Amelia returned to Atlanta to conduct forensic analysis of the photograph. Using modern imaging technology, she was able to enhance details invisible to the naked eye, documenting every symptom visible in baby Grace's appearance. But it was James who made the breakthrough that would prove everything. "I found Sarah Williams' diary," he told Amelia over the phone, his voice shaking with excitement. It was in a collection of personal papers donated by Martha Johnson's descendants. "Amelia, Sarah documented everything, including the gifts." He read from his notes. "March 10th, 1905. Mrs. Ashford gave me a lovely basket of preserves and canned goods today. She said I work so hard and deserve something special for my family. How kind of her. The children will be so pleased." March 17th, 1905. Another gift from the Ashford household, a tin of sweet biscuits and a bottle of tonic. "Mrs. Ashford says the tonic is good for babies, helps them grow strong. I'll give some to Grace tonight." Amelia felt sick. The tonic. That's how they did it. Arsenic dissolved in liquid, given specifically for the baby. "It gets worse," James said. April 2nd, 1805. "Grace seems more poorly every day. She won't eat, cries often, and her skin looks so pale. I'm worried sick. Mrs. Ashford says to keep giving her the tonic, that sometimes babies get worse before they get better. She's been so generous, giving me extra bottles since Grace is so ill." "They encouraged Sarah to increase the dose," Amelia said, rage building. "They told her the poison was medicine." James continued reading. April 10th, 1905. "Daniel is concerned about Grace. He wants to take her to the doctor, but we can't afford it right now, especially with the church case taking so much of his time. Mrs. Ashford heard me mention this and gave me money for a doctor visit. $5. So generous. I cried with gratitude." "Blood money," Amelia whispered. April 14th, 1905. "Tomorrow we sit for a family portrait. Mama insisted, even though it's expensive. She says she wants a picture of all of us together, wants to remember how we look right now. I think she's being overly sentimental, but Daniel agrees. He says with everything happening with the church case, it's good to have family documented. We'll go to Marcus Webb's studio." That was the last diary entry before the photograph. Sarah had stopped writing for nearly a month after that. When the entries resumed in late May, they were in Martha's handwriting. Sarah was already dead. James had also found something else, Ashford family household records, including purchases made by the household staff. "Look at this. March through May 1905. Multiple purchases of Fowler's Solution from a local pharmacy." "Fowler's Solution," Amelia said. "That was a patent medicine containing arsenic, marketed as a tonic for various ailments. It would be the perfect poison, readily available, looked like legitimate medicine, and contained enough arsenic to kill slowly." "And here's the pharmacist's ledger," James said. "The Ashford household purchased 12 bottles in 3 months. For a household that size, that's excessive. Unless they were using it for something other than medicine." Amelia thought about Sarah Williams, a hard-working laundress, grateful for the kindness of her wealthy employer, taking home gifts, feeding the tonic to her sick baby, never suspecting that the generosity was actually murder. "We need to find out what happened to Cornelius Ashford," Amelia said. "Did he face any consequences?" James had already researched that. He didn't. The property case was dismissed after Daniel died. Ashford developed that land and made a fortune. He died in 1932, wealthy and respected. His obituary in the Savannah Morning News called him a prominent businessman and community leader. While Daniel and Sarah Williams were buried in an unmarked grave in a segregated cemetery, Amelia said bitterly. "Actually," James said quietly, "Martha made sure they had proper headstones. I found them. The cemetery records show she paid for the stones herself, probably used every penny she had saved. The inscriptions say, Daniel Williams, beloved husband and father, truth teller. Sarah Williams, beloved wife and mother, faithful servant. And then, at the bottom of both stones, justice delayed is justice denied." Amelia felt tears on her cheeks. Martha Johnson had buried her daughter and son-in-law, knowing they'd been murdered, unable to get justice, but leaving a message carved in stone for anyone who would listen. Justice delayed. But perhaps, 119 years later, not justice denied. Dorothy invited Amelia back to her home with a specific purpose. "I want you to hear the story directly from someone who lived it, or as close as we can get. Grandma Grace recorded an oral history in 1985 when she was 80 years old. I have the cassette tapes." They sat in Dorothy's living room as an elderly woman's voice filled the space, crackling but clear through the old recording. "My name is Grace Williams, and I'm the only member of my immediate family who survived 1905. I was 10 months old when someone decided my family had to die. I don't remember my parents. I was too young. But my grandmother Martha told me everything, and my older siblings Thomas and Elizabeth made sure I knew the truth about what was taken from us. Grace's voice was strong despite her age, with a slight southern accent softened by decades of living in Florida and Georgia. The doctor said I should have died. Grandmother Martha told me that after Mom and Papa passed, she took us children to a doctor in Jacksonville, a black doctor who wouldn't report to white authorities. He examined me and said I had all the signs of arsenic poisoning. My liver was damaged, my kidneys weren't functioning properly, and I was severely malnourished because the poison had destroyed my ability to absorb nutrients. Grace paused, and they could hear her take a sip of water. That doctor's name was Dr. Benjamin Foster. He saved my life. He couldn't remove the arsenic that was already in my system, but he could treat the symptoms and help my body heal. Grandmother Martha sold everything she had to pay for my medical care. She was a washwoman herself, just like my mama had been, and she spent every penny on keeping me alive. It took 2 years before I was truly healthy. Even then, I was smaller than other children my age, and I had problems with my stomach and kidneys my whole life. Another pause, longer this time. I lived because my grandmother loved me enough to sacrifice everything. And I lived because Dr. Foster believed I deserved a chance, even though I was just a poor black baby that the world had tried to throw away. But most of all, I lived because I had a purpose. Grandmother Martha told me when I was old enough to understand, Grace, you are the evidence. You survived so you could testify. Someday, someone will ask the right questions, and you will tell them what happened to your family. Amelia wiped her eyes as the tape continued. I grew up knowing my parents were murdered. I grew up with the photograph Grandmother Martha had insisted on taking, the one that shows me already sick, already poisoned, sitting in my mama's lap while she had no idea death was inside both of us. Mama survived long enough to get me to Grandmother Martha, thank God. If we'd still been in that house when she and Papa collapsed, I would have died too. Grace's voice strengthened with determination. I became a teacher. I taught for 43 years in Jacksonville public schools. I wanted to honor my father, who believed in education and truth, and my mother, who worked so hard to give her children a better life. I married a good man, James Harper, and we had 3 children. I told them all about their grandparents, about the property case, about Cornelius Ashford, about the arsenic hidden in gifts and kind words. I'm 80 years old now, and I'm recording this because I want the story preserved. I want my descendants to know what happened, and I want whoever eventually investigates, because someone will, I believe that, to know that I survived. I am the proof. My body carries the scars of arsenic poisoning. Medical records can confirm it. I am the living testimony that my family was murdered. The recording ended. Dorothy stopped the tape and looked at Amelia. Grandma Grace died 4 years after making that recording. But before she died, she made me promise 2 things. Keep the evidence safe and never let the story die. She said, Dorothy, the truth is like a seed. It might be buried for a long time, but eventually it will grow. Make sure it grows. Amelia nodded, understanding the weight of that promise. Do you still have Grace's medical records? The ones from Dr. Foster? Yes, everything. Grandmother Martha kept every medical bill, every doctor's note, every prescription. She documented Grace's recovery meticulously. I think she knew that someday those records would be important. Dorothy pulled out another folder. Inside were medical records from 1905 to 1907, documenting baby Grace's treatment. Amelia read through them carefully, her medical training allowing her to understand the details. Dr. Foster had been thorough and precise in his documentation. He'd noted the symptoms consistent with arsenic poisoning, the treatment protocol, and Grace's slow recovery. Most importantly, he'd written a detailed memo dated June 1905, just after Daniel and Sarah's deaths, stating his professional opinion that the baby had been deliberately poisoned and that the parents' sudden deaths were consistent with acute arsenic toxicity. This is extraordinary evidence, Amelia said. Dr. Foster essentially wrote a murder report, even though he knew it would never be officially investigated. He gave it to Grandmother Martha and told her to keep it safe, Dorothy said. He told her that someday things would change. Someday justice might be possible. He died in 1923, never seeing that day. But he made sure the evidence existed. Amelia held the fragile documents carefully. Between the photograph showing visible symptoms, Sarah's diary documenting the gifts, the pharmacy records showing excessive arsenic purchases, and now medical records confirming poisoning, they had built an undeniable case. 119 years after the crime, the truth could finally be proven. James discovered the extent of the cover-up when he found Savannah Police Department records from 1905. The investigation into Daniel and Sarah Williams' deaths had been perfunctory at best, deliberately negligent at worst. Look at this, he told Amelia over a video call, holding up photographed police reports. The responding officer spent less than 30 minutes at the scene. His report says, 2 colored individuals found deceased in home. No signs of forced entry or struggle. Appears to be natural causes, likely influenza. Bodies removed to colored funeral home. Case closed. Less than 30 minutes to investigate 2 deaths, Amelia said incredulously. No autopsy, no toxicology, no interviews with family members. Because they were black, and because someone powerful wanted it buried, James said. But I found something else, something that proves the police knew exactly what they were doing. He pulled up another document. And this is a memo from the police chief to the investigating officer, dated the day before Daniel and Sarah's bodies were found. It says, Daniel Williams property case. Handle any matters related to Williams' family with discretion. Coordinate with Mr. Ashford's legal representative before filing reports. They were given instructions to cover it up before the murders even happened, Amelia said, stunned. The police chief was in Ashford's pocket. I found campaign finance records. Ashford was one of his biggest donors. James' face was grim. This wasn't just murder. It was a conspiracy involving law enforcement, the court system, and prominent businessmen. Amelia thought about Martha Johnson, arriving to find her daughter and son-in-law dead, 3 grieving children, and a police force that had no interest in investigating. What choice did she have but to flee? I also found records of what happened to the church property, James continued. After Ashford won the case, he immediately sold it to a development company for a huge profit. That development company, owned partially by the same judge who presided over the property case. The corruption went all the way to the top. All the way, and it gets worse. I found newspaper archives from black newspapers in Charleston and Jacksonville. There were at least 6 other similar cases between 1903 and 1910. Black families involved in property disputes or legal cases against white businessmen, suddenly dying of mysterious illnesses. None of them were investigated properly. Amelia felt sick. This wasn't an isolated incident, this was systematic. It was a method of control. If black people challenged white economic power, they were eliminated. Their deaths were ruled natural causes or accidents, and life went on, except for the families destroyed, the children orphaned, the communities terrorized. Dorothy, who was listening on speakerphone, spoke up. Grandma Grace used to say that her parents weren't the first and wouldn't be the last. She said Grandmother Martha knew of other families, other deaths that seemed suspicious. But no one could prove anything, and anyone who asked too many questions put themselves at risk. James pulled up one more document. Now, this is a letter from First African Church's pastor, written in 1906 to a church in Philadelphia. He's asking for financial help because the church lost the property case and is now deeply in debt. But look at this paragraph. He read aloud. We have lost more than land. We have lost Brother Daniel Williams, whose courage and truth-telling cost him his life. We all know how he died, though we cannot speak it aloud. We all know who killed him, though we cannot name names. This is the price of seeking justice in Savannah. This is the burden we carry. They all knew, Amelia said quietly. The entire community knew Daniel and Sarah were murdered, but they were powerless to do anything about it. Except keep the story alive, Dorothy said. Except pass it down through generations. Except wait for the day when someone would finally listen and believe them. That night, Amelia couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about the photograph, about baby Grace's poisoned face, about Sarah Williams feeding arsenic to her own child while thinking it was medicine, about Daniel Williams' meticulous fraud report that should have brought justice, but instead brought death. She thought about Cornelius Ashford, dying wealthy and honored while Daniel and Sarah lay in a segregated cemetery. She thought about the police chief who took bribes, the judge who was financially involved with the murderer, the doctor who never performed an autopsy because he was told not to. And she thought about Martha Johnson, packing up 3 traumatized children and fleeing in the night, carrying evidence of murder that she knew would never be heard in her lifetime. The system hadn't just failed the Williams family, the system had actively participated in their murder and the cover-up that followed. But now, 119 years later, the system couldn't hide the truth anymore. The evidence existed, the documentation was there, the medical records proved it, the photograph showed it. Justice had been delayed for more than a century, but it wouldn't be denied any longer. Amelia and James decided to present their findings at the National Conference on African American History in Washington, D.C. The presentation was titled Hidden in Plain Sight, Forensic Evidence of Murder in a 1905 Family Portrait. The conference room was packed. Historians, medical professionals, descendants of African American families from the Jim Crow era, and journalists filled every seat. Amelia had arranged for Dorothy to attend, and baby Grace's great-grandchildren, Dorothy's children, came to witness their family's story being told to the world. Amelia began by displaying the photograph on a large screen. This is a family portrait taken in Savannah, Georgia, on April 15, 1905. At first glance, it appears to be an ordinary formal portrait. But hidden in this image is evidence of an ongoing crime, a crime that would claim 2 lives and nearly claim a third. She zoomed in on baby Grace's face, highlighting the symptoms. This infant is showing clear signs of chronic arsenic poisoning. The periorbital edema, skin discoloration, and mottled pattern on the hands are unmistakable to anyone trained in toxicology. The room was silent as Amelia walked through the evidence. Sarah's diary documenting the gifts, the pharmacy records showing arsenic purchases, Dr. Foster's medical documentation of Grace's poisoning, the police department's deliberately inadequate investigation, and the broader pattern of suspicious deaths among black families challenging white economic power. James took over to explain the property fraud case, displaying Daniel Williams' expert report and the court documents showing how the case was dismissed after his death. Daniel Williams was murdered because he told the truth, James said. He documented fraud, presented irrefutable evidence, and was prepared to testify. Cornelius Ashford couldn't allow that testimony to happen. So he poisoned an entire family, slowly, methodically, using the trust Sarah Williams had in her employer to deliver the poison directly into her home. Dorothy stood to speak, her voice steady despite her emotion. My grandmother, Grace, lived to be 82 years old. She survived arsenic poisoning as an infant, grew up without her parents, and spent her entire life waiting for someone to ask the right questions. She told me, Dorothy, truth is patient. It will wait as long as it needs to, but eventually it will be heard. Today, 119 years after someone tried to murder my family and erase my great-grandparents' courage, that truth is finally being heard. The presentation ended with a standing ovation, but more importantly, it ended with action. A journalist from the Washington Post approached Amelia immediately. This story needs national attention. Can I interview you and Dorothy? A documentary filmmaker expressed interest in creating a film about the case. A civil rights attorney specializing in historical justice cases wanted to explore legal options. Could the Ashford estate be held liable? Could the city of Savannah be compelled to officially acknowledge the murder and cover-up? But the most moving moment came when an elderly man approached Dorothy after the presentation. He was in his 90s, walking with a cane, his eyes bright with tears. My name is Thomas Williams, he said. I'm your cousin. My grandfather was Thomas Williams, Grace's older brother. Dorothy stared at him in shock. I didn't know Thomas had any living descendants. Grandma Grace lost touch with that side of the family decades ago. We've been looking for Grace's descendants for years, Thomas said. My grandfather talked about his parents' death until the day he died. He was 9 years old when it happened, old enough to remember everything. He remembered the gifts from Mrs. Ashford, remembered baby Grace getting sicker and sicker, remembered his father's worry about the court case, and he remembered his grandmother Martha waking him and Elizabeth in the middle of the night, telling them they had to leave Savannah immediately, that it wasn't safe. Thomas pulled out a worn photograph. This is my grandfather in 1960, at age 64. He's standing in front of First African Church in Savannah, the church his father died defending. The photograph showed an elderly black man standing with quiet dignity in front of the historic church building. Every year on the anniversary of his parents' death, my grandfather would visit Savannah and stand in front of that church, Thomas said. He never went inside. He said it hurt too much, knowing his father had been killed trying to protect that sacred ground. But he stood outside, bearing witness. He did that for 50 years. Dorothy embraced her newfound cousin, both crying. Amelia watched, understanding that she'd done more than solve a historical mystery. She'd reunited a family scattered by trauma, given voice to the voiceless, and brought hidden truth into the light. The story went viral within days. The Washington Post article was shared millions of times. The photograph of baby Grace, with visible signs of poisoning, became a symbol of the countless crimes committed against black families during Jim Crow. Crimes that were covered up, ignored, and forgotten. But not anymore. Not this family, not this story. The city of Savannah initially tried to ignore the growing national attention, but public pressure became impossible to resist. 3 months after Amelia's presentation, the mayor announced the formation of a special historical commission to investigate the Williams family case and other suspicious deaths of black citizens during the Jim Crow era. Amelia and James were invited to testify before the commission. They brought all their evidence, the photograph, the medical records, Sarah's diary, the pharmacy ledgers, police reports, and the pattern of similar cases. The hearing was held in Savannah's City Hall, a building that would have barred Daniel and Sarah Williams from entering in 1905. Now, more than a century later, their story was being heard in its chambers. Dorothy testified about her grandmother Grace's life, about growing up knowing your parents were murdered, about the weight of carrying that truth for generations. Thomas Williams testified about his grandfather's annual vigils, about a 9-year-old boy who never forgot watching his parents collapse, about a family that scattered in fear and took decades to find each other again. Local historians testified about the pattern of black families losing property through fraud and violence, about the systematic disenfranchisement and economic oppression that defined the era. Medical experts confirmed Amelia's analysis of the photograph, agreeing that baby Grace showed unmistakable signs of arsenic poisoning. The commission's final report, issued 6 months later, was unequivocal. Based on overwhelming evidence, this commission finds that Daniel and Sarah Williams were murdered by person or persons acting on behalf of Cornelius Ashford, with the knowledge and complicity of Savannah Police Department officials and potentially members of the judiciary. The subsequent cover-up represents a gross miscarriage of justice and a betrayal of the public trust. The city of Savannah failed in its most basic duty, to protect all its citizens and investigate crimes fairly. The report recommended several actions: official exoneration and recognition of Daniel Williams' expert testimony in the property fraud case, a formal apology to the Williams family descendants, renaming a street in the historic district in Williams Family Way, and the creation of a memorial honoring victims of racial violence and systematic injustice in Savannah. But the most significant recommendation was about the property itself. The report noted that First African Church had lost 5 acres of valuable land through fraud, and that loss had been compounded by the murder of their key witness. The commission recommended that the city of Savannah, using eminent domain if necessary, acquire the property and return it to First African Church, along with compensation for 119 years of lost use. The recommendation was controversial. The property was now worth an estimated $15 million occupied by a commercial development. But the commission argued that justice delayed was still justice due, and that the city had a moral and legal obligation to remedy a wrong in which it had been complicit. After intense public debate, the city council voted to proceed. It took 2 years of legal negotiations, but eventually, First African Church regained ownership of the land their congregation had fought for in 1905, the land Daniel Williams had died defending. The church announced plans to build a community center on the property, with a museum dedicated to the history of black property ownership and the families who fought to maintain it. The centerpiece of that museum would be the 1905 photograph of the Williams family, with detailed explanation of what it represented and what it had ultimately achieved. At the groundbreaking ceremony, Dorothy stood beside the pastor of First African Church, her hand resting on a shovel, ready to break ground on a building that existed because her great-grandfather had told the truth, and her great-grandmother had documented the consequences. "This isn't just about property," Dorothy said to the assembled crowd. "This is about recognition. For 119 years, my family's story was dismissed, ignored, and hidden. My great-grandparents were murdered, and no one cared because they were black and their killer was powerful. But truth is stronger than power. Truth outlasts injustice. And today, we prove that it's never too late to set the record straight." She looked at the photograph, enlarged and displayed on a banner. Daniel and Sarah, young and dignified with their 3 children, baby Grace visible in her mother's arms, showing signs of the poison that was killing her. "You didn't die in vain," Dorothy whispered. "Your courage meant something. Your sacrifice achieved something. Justice came late, but it came, and we will make sure no one ever forgets." The Williams family case inspired a broader movement. Historians and forensic specialists began systematically reviewing historical photographs and documents, looking for evidence of crimes that had been covered up or ignored during the Jim Crow era. Amelia led a team that established the Historical Justice Documentation Project, using modern forensic techniques to analyze old photographs for signs of violence, poisoning, or other crimes. They partnered with descendants of African American families across the South who had long held suspicions about ancestors' deaths, but had never been able to prove anything. The project uncovered dozens of cases similar to the Williams family, black individuals who had challenged white economic power or testified against white criminals, only to die suddenly of mysterious illnesses that were never properly investigated. In several cases, photographs showed visible signs of poisoning or injury that had been overlooked or deliberately ignored at the time. One particularly significant discovery involved a photograph from Birmingham in 1908, showing a family of 6. Using the same analytical techniques Amelia had applied to the Williams photograph, researchers identified signs of lead poisoning in 3 of the children. Investigation revealed that the father had been organizing black steelworkers to demand safer working conditions and fair wages. He and his wife died within weeks of each other of sudden illness, and the children were separated and sent to different relatives. The photograph, taken a month before the parents' deaths, provided the first concrete evidence of the poisoning. The project also developed educational materials for schools, teaching students how to read historical photographs critically and understand the hidden stories they might contain. The Williams family photograph became a case study used in history and forensic science classes across the country. Dorothy became a sought-after speaker, traveling to universities and conferences to share her grandmother's story. She always brought copies of the photograph, passing them around so people could see baby Grace's face up close, could understand that this wasn't abstract history. This was real people, a real family, a real crime. "When people see this photograph now," Dorothy told one university audience, "they don't just see a nice family portrait. They see evidence. They see courage. They see the price my great-grandparents paid for telling the truth. And they understand that history isn't something that happened far away and long ago. History is in every family, every photograph, every story that gets passed down. We just have to be willing to look closely and ask hard questions. The project's work led to official recognition in several states. Georgia issued a formal apology for the systematic failure to investigate crimes against black citizens during the Jim Crow era. South Carolina established a Truth and Reconciliation Commission to document racial violence and identify unmarked graves of victims. Alabama created a fund to support descendants of families who had lost property through fraud or violence. These were small steps, incomplete justice for massive wrongs. But they were steps nonetheless, acknowledgement that the crimes had happened and that they mattered. 3 years after discovering the Williams family photograph, Amelia was invited to present her work at the Smithsonian Institution. The National Museum of African American History and Culture wanted to acquire the original photograph and related materials for their permanent collection. Dorothy agreed on one condition. The exhibit has to tell the whole story, not just the poisoning and the murder, but the resistance. My great-grandfather fought fraud and corruption. My great-grandmother survived and testified. My grandmother carried the truth for 80 years. My family never stopped believing that justice would come. That's the story, not just what was done to us, but what we did in response. We didn't give up. We didn't forget. We kept faith with the truth. The exhibit opened with the photograph displayed prominently, Baby Grace's poisoned face visible to thousands of visitors. But surrounding it were documents showing Daniel's meticulous fraud investigation, excerpts from Sarah's diary showing her love for her family, Martha's letter to her sister revealing the truth, Dr. Foster's medical records documenting his determination to save Grace's life, and photographs of Grace as an elderly woman, surrounded by the family she'd built despite everything that had been taken from her. The exhibit's title was simple. They tried to erase us, one family's fight for truth and justice. On opening day, Dorothy stood in front of the photograph with her children and grandchildren, 5 generations removed from Daniel and Sarah Williams, but carrying their legacy forward. This photograph saved our family's story, Dorothy said. Baby Grace's poisoned face, visible in this image, is the reason anyone believed us. Without this evidence, we would have been just another black family telling stories about injustice that white people could dismiss as exaggeration or bitterness. But this photograph doesn't lie. It shows what was done to us. And now, finally, people are listening. A young girl, maybe 10 years old, approached Dorothy after the ceremony. "Was that your grandma? The baby in the picture?" "Yes," Dorothy said, kneeling down to the girl's level. "That was my grandmother, Grace. She was poisoned, but she lived." "She lived. She survived because people loved her and fought for her. She survived to become a teacher and a mother and a grandmother. She survived to tell the truth." The girl studied the photograph intently. "I'm going to be a doctor when I grow up, so I can help people like Baby Grace." Dorothy smiled through tears. "That's exactly what my grandmother would have wanted. She always said her survival had to mean something, had to make a difference for other people. You make it mean something." That, Dorothy realized, was the real legacy, not just exposing one crime or getting recognition for one family, but inspiring the next generation to seek truth, to demand justice, to refuse to let stories be buried and forgotten. The photograph had done its work. 119 years after it was taken, it was still bearing witness, still telling truth, still changing lives. 5 years after Amelia first noticed the peculiar discoloration in Baby Grace's photograph, she returned to Savannah for a special ceremony. The Williams Family Community Center was opening on the land that had been stolen from First African Church in 1905 and finally returned in 2026. The building was beautiful, a modern structure that honored historical architectural styles while looking firmly toward the future. Its entrance featured a massive reproduction of the 1905 photograph, with Daniel and Sarah Williams looking out over the city that had failed them but was now finally honoring their memory. Dorothy cut the ribbon alongside the pastor of First African Church and the mayor of Savannah. The crowd was large and diverse, descendants of the Williams family, members of First African Church, historians, activists, and ordinary citizens who had followed the story and understood its significance. Inside, the museum told the story comprehensively. It began with the history of First African Church and black property ownership in Savannah. It documented the systematic efforts to dispossess black families of their land and wealth. It explained the legal and extra-legal methods used to maintain white economic control. Then it focused on the Williams family. Daniel's background as a skilled carpenter and property assessor, Sarah's work as a laundress supporting her family. There are 3 children growing up in the thriving Auburn Avenue community. The fraud case was explained in detail, with Daniel's expert report displayed alongside Ashford's forged deed. Visitors could see for themselves the evidence Daniel had compiled, understand why his testimony would have been devastating. And then came the poisoning. Sarah's diary entries were displayed, showing her gratitude for the gifts that were killing her family. The pharmacy records showed the excessive arsenic purchases. Dr. Foster's medical notes documented Baby Grace's symptoms and treatment. The centerpiece was the photograph itself, displayed behind protective glass, with detailed annotations pointing out the visible signs of poisoning. Interactive displays allowed visitors to zoom in on baby Grace's face, to see what Amelia had seen that morning in 2024 when she first examined the image. But the exhibit didn't end with tragedy. It continued with Martha Johnson's flight to Jacksonville, the children's survival, Grace's recovery, and her long life as a teacher and mother. It showed Thomas Williams' annual vigils at First African Church, keeping his parents' memory alive for 50 years. It documented the decades of silence when the truth was known within the family, but couldn't be proven or publicly acknowledged. And finally, it showed the breakthrough. Amelia's discovery, James's research, Dorothy's testimony, and the slow process of achieving recognition and justice. The final room of the exhibit was titled The Power of Evidence. It explained how the photograph had made everything possible, how without that visual documentation of baby Grace's poisoning, the family's story might never have been believed. But it also emphasized that evidence alone wasn't enough. Evidence needed people willing to examine it critically, to ask hard questions, to challenge official narratives. It needed descendants willing to preserve family stories even when they were painful. It needed institutions willing to acknowledge past wrongs and take steps toward justice. Truth needs witnesses, read the wall text. The Williams family photograph witnessed a crime. Dr. Foster witnessed the poisoning and documented it. Martha Johnson witnessed the cover-up and preserved the evidence. Grace Williams witnessed through her survival and her testimony. And finally, more than a century later, we witness by looking at this evidence with clear eyes and honest hearts, and by acting on what we see. At the opening ceremony, Amelia was invited to speak. She stood at the podium, looking out at faces young and old, black and white, descendants and strangers all gathered to honor a family most of them had never heard of 5 years earlier. When I first saw that photograph, Amelia began, I was looking at it as a medical historian, searching for evidence of diseases and health conditions in the past. I wasn't expecting to find evidence of murder, but once I saw it, once I understood what baby Grace's symptoms meant, I couldn't look away. She paused, gathering her thoughts. The Williams family photograph teaches us something crucial. The past is not really past. It lives in documents and photographs and family stories and community memories. It lives in the consequences that ripple through generations. Daniel and Sarah Williams were murdered 120 years ago, but that crime shaped their children's lives, their grandchildren's lives, and continues to shape their great-great-grandchildren's lives today. But the photograph also teaches us about resilience. Baby Grace shouldn't have survived. The doctor said so. But she did, because her grandmother loved her fiercely and fought for her. She survived, and she thrived, and she passed down the truth. That's power. That's resistance. That's refusing to be erased. Amelia looked directly at Dorothy, sitting in the front row. Dorothy, your grandmother Grace told you that someday someone would ask the right questions. I'm grateful I was able to be that person. But the real credit belongs to your family, to Martha Johnson, who kept the evidence, to Grace, who survived and testified, to you, who kept the faith that justice would come. You never stopped believing. You never stopped telling the truth. That's why we're here today. The ceremony concluded with the unveiling of a memorial sculpture in front of the community center. It showed 5 figures, Daniel, Sarah, and their 3 children, standing together, Daniel's hand protectively on Sarah's shoulder, Sarah holding baby Grace, the older children close to their parents. The inscription read, The Williams Family. Daniel, 1870-1905. Sarah, 1872-1905. Thomas, 1896-1982. Elizabeth, 1893-1995. Grace, 1904-1989. They sought truth and paid the ultimate price. Their courage, preserved in a photograph, finally brought justice. May we honor their memory by never allowing such crimes to be hidden, forgotten, or repeated. As the sun set over Savannah, Dorothy stood before the sculpture with her extended family, dozens of descendants of Grace Williams, whose survival had made all of them possible. We're here, Dorothy said softly, touching the bronze face of baby Grace. We survived. We remembered. And we made sure the world remembered too. She turned to face the community center, the building that existed because her great-grandfather had told the truth about a forged deed, because her great-grandmother had documented gifts that were really poison, because her grandmother had lived through poisoning and spent 80 years waiting for justice because a photograph had preserved evidence that couldn't be denied. This is what truth looks like, Dorothy said. It looks like my family standing here, claiming our place in history. It looks like this building, rising on land that was stolen but is now returned. It looks like baby Grace's face in that photograph, showing the world what was done to us and refusing to let it be forgotten. She smiled, tears streaming down her face. Grandma Grace, we did it. We told your story, we honored your parents, we brought you home. And somewhere in the twilight, across 120 years of silence and struggle and survival, a baby's cry became a voice, and that voice finally spoke truth that the world could hear. The photograph had done its work. Justice had come home.